I'm Suzy Shaw, mom of two, now adult boys, and author of the book Mother of Boys Survival Guide. This podcast shares practical insights, expert advice, and real conversations to help moms raise confident, capable boys. You can find more episodes and resources at mothersofboys.life. Now, let's get into today's conversation. Why kids should learn coding, preparing children to understand AI and build technology. Welcome to the Mothers of Boys podcast. Artificial intelligence is suddenly everywhere. Our kids are using it for homework help, search, and entertainment. But very few actually understand how it works. And that raises an important question for parents. Are we raising kids who simply use technology or kids who understand how to build it? My guest today believes that teaching children the foundations of coding and computational thinking is one of the best ways to prepare them for the world they're growing up in. Elizabeth Tweedale is a serial tech entrepreneur and the founder of Coco Coders, an educational company that teaches children ages 6 to 14 the foundations of coding, computational thinking, and AI problem solving. As both a mother of three and a global voice in education technology, Elizabeth is passionate about helping kids become creators of technology rather than passive users. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me, Suzy.
So, Elizabeth, before we dive into all this, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and what led you to start and launch Coco Coders and focus on kids?
Sure. Well, my background is a bit of a bridge between two worlds. I started my undergrad in computer science, but I've always been drawn to design. So I went on to get my master's in architecture. And when I got into the industry and worked for some of the world's leading firms, I had a massive light bulb moment. I saw that even really in deeply creative, physical, professional worlds like architecture, that people who were truly leading that industry were the ones who understood computation and computational thinking. So we were we weren't just building architecture and drawing drawings. We were actually writing code to simulate how wind hits a skyscraper, or how light fills a room, or how to redraw drawings based on geometry with slight changes that might come from the brief. It was the fundamental language of the modern world, was this new way of taking the tools that we've developed in computer science and applying it to practical worlds. So I really then started Coco Coders because of what I was seeing out there in industry, and also having my own children. And I wanted to give them that same superpower that I saw in industry, and the ability to use logic and coding and an understanding of the technology that was being built in their lives to bring any creative vision to life or future world that they could create for themselves.
And how old are your children?
I have a 17-year-old son, a 15-year-old daughter, and a 7-year-old daughter. So two close together, and then one that popped up later.
I think many parents can relate to the feeling of feeling overwhelmed by technology. I know in my own personal life, I began in broadcast television 40 years ago. And when I started my career, everything was analog. And then it became digital. And then cell phones became a thing. And so the technology just seems to be growing faster and faster and evolving. So why do you believe it's so important for kids to learn, the foundations of coding and computational thinking rather than just using the tools and the apps and devices that are available?
Well, I like to think of it this way. Most kids today are really just players in a world that's designed by someone else. So they're playing the game, following the paths laid out for them by the developers. But what we want to raise are modders, which I know, on one of your previous podcasts, thinking about Minecraft and Roblox and how, that whole gaming industry works with children. So if you have boys that, that the second they get home, they get into those games, they don't just wanna play, they wanna change the world, create their own skins, and break the rules. So, when a child only knows how to use an app, they are just the players. When they learn the foundations of coding, they get the chance and the kind of developer key to the world. They transition from just being those consumers of technology that we talk about, who are directed by the technology and where should go and what levels they should pass and how they should use their apps, to being the creators who really define how that technology will serve them and serve their purpose.
I call my boys Ernest and Exuberance, and in my book, and Ernest was my Lego kid, and he liked building things. And when we discovered Lego Mindstorm when he was probably in middle school, you know, that had some really basic level of programming that was part of it to make these little robots that would do things. And then that sort of led into, in high school, getting into robotics club, and that was just a breakthrough for him. Now he's in IT and, doing cybersecurity. When you talk about, the difference between being a consumer of technology to a creator, what do you think that
Mhm.
shift looks like for kids? And is that the Lego Mindstorm sort of branch, or, what does that look like?
I think that's a perfect example of a tool that can help facilitate that. But really, what it looks like is the shift from moving from how do I use this to how do I direct this. So, finding toys and applications and processes that kids can interact with and experience that. I like to think that in this kind of AI era, we're seeing a huge shift towards prompt engineering and sort of system oversight, which I know you talked about previously in your cybersecurity podcast. So, to be a creator now, you have to really understand how AI is trained or how it's built underneath the scene. That is essentially a giant pattern recognition machine fed on human data. So if a kid can understand that AI is just predicting the next likely word or pixel, like when you're typing your text in your iMessage, based on what they're taught, they become much better at prompting it and also understanding where they're going to lead it. They can learn that the quality of the output depends entirely on the clarity of their logic. So it matters because the sort of creators of the future won't be the ones who can type the fastest. They'll be the ones who can architect the best instructions and recognize when the AI has its hallucinations or goes off piste, if you will.
Right. And it does go off track. And I I always think it's funny the way it apologizes. It's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
you're right.
Yes.
My bad." Um,
He question.
which
Oh, yes. I'm so sorry.
which then gets back to, how did you ask the question? I mean, I think that's sort of your point, is the prompt, learning
Mhm.
how to better manage the AI and the systems, you get a better result, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. I think, it comes back around to computational thinking and how we actually build that up. And you brought up Lego Mindstorms as a perfect example. So if we think about computational thinking, even just going to the non-programmable Lego, it's that exact same tool set. So you can give two kids the exact same box of 1,000 Legos. One might build a castle and the other might build a spaceship. The bricks haven't changed, but the logic of the assembly has changed. So that computational thinking piece is just that. It's the mental framework for how you snap ideas together to solve problems and how you use your own intuition with preconceived structure to create something that you like.
Well, and I guess, that's how children begin to learn with this computational thinking. Um,
Yes,
what does that
exactly.
look like in one of your classes?
Well, I think in our classes, we have sort of 4-week modules, and at the end of 4 weeks, each one is a different theme that relates to real world applications like aerospace engineering or vertical farming or, um, things like that. In week 3 and week 4, there's specific challenges to add to the projects that they've created in weeks 1 and 2. And those are broken up into small challenges, medium, and big. But they're given to the kids, and they're not always the same, answer to get to the solution. So, one of the examples that I like to use to explain computational thinking and sort of the difference between how we think about solving a problem in computer science versus math. You have an algebraic equation in math, and there's a very specific set of steps that you have to go through in order to solve the problem. But in computer science, you might have a test question that says, draw 5 stick people in a row.
Mhm.
And so one child could draw 5 circles spaced out and then 5 little bodies, 5 little legs, 5 little arms. The next child could finish the exact same assignment, but draw one little stick person, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one, solving the exact same problem, but using different ways to put the building blocks together in order to do it. So I think that's kind of the essence of computational thinking and how we can demystify it for parents.
So, we recently shared a podcast on raising cyber smart kids in the age of AI. You mentioned that earlier, and
Mhm.
tips for parents. And we have a resource page as well. And we'll add this podcast and anything else that you think would be relevant for parents to that resource page. This AI programming, computational thinking, helping kids understand it, building systems. It seems to me that it would impact almost not everything, but a good portion of their life, right? So if
Mhm.
you understand better how to ask a question in in these sort of in this framework, you're going to get a better response even out of Google or out of the library or Chat GPT or whatever the AI is that you're right? Is that correct? Is that where you think the superpower of this is?
Yes, that's exactly it. I think understanding the foundations of AI and the systems that they're built on for kids really just pulls back the curtain on the magic. It seems like magic. You put something in and you get out this answer. But when kids can understand how the code is built, they realize that AI isn't an all knowing spirit out there in the ethos. It's a system built by humans using large language models. So, all of the things that we've put out there on the internet or all of the documents that we've fed it to understand how we think, what we know, and what we've said in the past. So, they learn that AI is essentially trained on these massive data sets, which means it carries all those biases and errors of the information it was given. So if it's trained on Reddit versus, Wikipedia versus, published white papers that have been, peer reviewed by, doctorates,
Right.
it's going to have different training mechanisms behind it. So it's not an oracle to be followed blindly. It really makes the technology less vague and less intimidating. And they start to see it as a very fast, very powerful intern that they still need a smart human boss to check in with, but they can
Mhm.
also start to question where the information is coming from and how seriously they should take it.
Right. Yeah, that's really fascinating, relevant, and, I experience this all the time, and I think it's fabulous that you're teaching kids this, and especially the limitations of AI. I believe we call it
Mhm.
quirks. So, why is that an important skill for this generation to understand where it's going and how it's improving and its, quirks.
I think we kind of touched on this before, but because AI hallucinates, it makes mistakes that look incredibly accurate or plausible. And then, like you said, you say, "Oh, that doesn't really seem right." And they're like, "Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. You're so right. Actually, here's your right answer." But if a child doesn't understand those underlying logic, they'll really fall for a perfect looking misinformation. So an essay that looks like it's structured right, it has the right amount of paragraphs, it has the right amount of sentences, it ticks off the points, but they can't if they can't recognize those quirks, that's really the kind of high level critical thinking skill that we're trying to impart to their learning journey. And I like to say it's sort of the difference between being a passenger who doesn't notice the car is off course, say when it's um, self-driving itself, to being the navigator who sees the error in the map and is like, "Oh, actually, no, we don't want to turn that way. You should be going this way." And you take back over the reins and repoint it in the right direction. So what we really want is our children to have that human in the loop mindset, so
Mhm.
they are still skeptical and add that creative layer that makes the AI output actually useful and safe and, revisit its own thinking process or thinking patterns because it tends to go down one journey and the answer might have been over there, but because it already was
Right.
shaking out the Skittles into the different colors and the yellow one already went to the cool colors, there's no way to get back to the warm colors, right? So, kind of just keeping an eye on it as it goes and using those critical thinking skills is number one important piece here.
Well, and as, kids grow up and they, move into careers, there's real cause and effect that happens. I recently talked with a lawyer who told me of a case where somebody was trying to validate to the court, these are the reasons that what I'm suggesting is correct. And the AI made up and totally hallucinated cases that were not real but fit the, criteria. And then the judge,
If there was
uh
a case like this would be a great example for
wouldn't
your
it have been a great
for
example?
your
Yes, and, they got dinged on their bar and fined for using cases that didn't exist as part of their argument, and I just think
wow.
that's a really interesting example of how hallucination, turns into actual, fines and money and can
And
impact your
something that
career.
looks real and believable.
Right. So, many moms and you and I have talked about this because 'cause we're sort of, the tech moms probably in our friend group, but I think many moms, are nervous about technology in their house and feel a
Mhm.
little bit of pressure to be the expert and, uh,
Hmm.
worry about screen time and how much, their kids and their family is, on the screen, and that seems to be their primary focus of limiting the amount of time that somebody's looking at the phone or the computer or the television or whatever the device is. So, you've now suggested there are real benefits from parents, understanding that. And, in a couple of other podcasts, um, we've talked about, this curiosity, especially as your kids become teenagers. And so, how
Mhm.
can that shift, asking our sons and kids to mentor us really and having that curiosity, how can that open the door to better conversations and understanding and relationships with our kids?
I think that's a great question because, you know, we all grew up, even, plus or minus a few decades, depending on how old your boys are, but with parents that were still pretty much the experts in whatever they were trying to pass on to us as children. And now that rug has been completely pulled from underneath our feet, so the anxiety is definitely there, and even just navigating screen time usage, which isn't necessarily a thing that should have a rigorous rule for all the kids that is always the same all of the time. One child's might be 5 minutes a day, one child might have unlimited resources. The app usage might be different in terms of what they're allowed to do. But one of the things that I think you brought up is that word of mentorship. I think that is definitely the great lever that we have at this moment in time, because for the first time, that expert in the room is often just as confused as the student, because the tools are literally changing every day. So even us as the tech moms in our mom groups are still confused. So we're right there with you. But by asking your sons to mentor you, you can then sort of shift that dynamic, and you're essentially modeling intellectual humility, which
Hmm.
they can then take forward into the universe. So you're showing him that it's okay to be a successful beginner and ask questions. It removes that hierarchy fear that we mostly all were probably parented on, and replaces it with more of a partnership of curiosity, as you said. So when you have your kids on screen time, if they're on TikTok, or you watching YouTube videos about something, playing Roblox, Minecraft, even just asking to be a participant in that learning journey will go a long way, because when um, your child, when he explains, say, the game mechanic or an AI prompt to you that he's asking help with for his homework, he's actually reinforcing his own logical thinking by just reteaching his thought process back to you. So I feel like it's a real opportunity for us to shift that screen time from that passive activity. Even if they're actively playing a game, it's still, following that rule set that the developers have set them on the path towards, into a collaborative bridge between the two of you. And so you don't have to go into the situation having any of the answers, or even knowing if you're saying tick tick or tick tock or the talkity tick. I don't even know. But you
Yeah.
just need to be that lead investigator in their screen time journey, and getting over that anxiety piece, which is the I need to know what I'm talking about, to I'm happy to not know. Can you show me?
Right.
And shifting the dynamic that way is, I think, a huge opportunity for us. But we've had very few, past mentors show us how to do it in terms of society.
I totally agree, and it it sort of reminds me when I first got into broadcast television, was interviewing people and little kids. One of my first projects was interviewing kindergartners, and I couldn't get anyone to say a sentence, you know? They would just give me these one-word
Yes.
answers, and
No.
so,
Maybe.
yes, no, who's your favorite character, Big Bird, whatever. So I asked my mom, who was a kindergarten teacher, I said, "How do you get little kids to talk with you?" And she says, "I pretend to be either deaf or dumb." So I'm like, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Could you explain that to me again?" Or "I didn't get it." And then they come full force in and want to explain it to you, and it's part of this power shift, I think, and curiosity, you know?
This is this is so funny, because that happens in our household. Will be, the girls might be eating dinner, and I'll say, "Oh, Rose, I only have 7 of these left, but we have 10 days that we need it to last for. How many more do I need?" And then my son or my husband will be like, 3. And I'm like, "Obviously, I know that, but I'm trying to work on the simple math over here." So
Right. Well, and when you're dealing with teenagers, it's even harder. Um, but yeah, joyful curiosity is what one of our teenage experts called it. So, if there's one mind shift you would love parents to make as they raise kids in this era of AI, and rapidly changing technology, what would it be?
That's a great question. I think there's so many things. Maybe it's just stop trying to cheat proof your child's life and start thought proofing their brain. So don't fear the tools that are popping up every day, but teach them to approach the tools with a mindset of mastering the logic and the asking of the questions behind where that piece of information or new app or new piece of technology is coming from. I think if we focus on teaching them to be the ones that are holding those architectural blueprints and architecting with intention, then
Mhm.
no matter how much the technology shifts and changes, they'll never become obsolete. They'll be the ones that will be asking the questions and then on top of it, building the future. So, yeah, just
I love that.
giving them
Adaptable,
free
right?
rein with restraint. Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
I it occurs to me just even understanding the possibility, um, is so powerful. I have a spreadsheet, and I was thinking this would be really cool as an app or put on a web page, and so I asked someone in my network who does that sort of thing, and they were like, "Well, if it's a spreadsheet, you should just throw it into, AI and ask it to create a page." And I was blown away by just even the thought of that. Like, that just hadn't ever occurred to me to use the tool in that way. So, the understanding of how to use the tool is so critical.
Yeah, and I think that is a great example as to maybe the kind of false sense of security that is descending on us as parents and maybe, broader society is that those tools are super powerful. They exist, but it will only get you to 80% of the way there, 90% of the way there. And then there's little errors like, it was telling you to always put in 30 centiliters of liquid instead of milliliters or wasn't converting things right. And I kid you not, that last 10 or 20% of getting the AI to tweak itself to make that new app that you've just thrown
Mhm.
in to Grok or ChatGPT or Gemini is extremely difficult if you don't have those foundational tools and understanding to then look under the hood and say, this is where it needs to change.
So I ask all of our guests to give a quote for moms who are, trying to figure all this out, this coding, AI, technology. What do you say to yourself or, the parents of your students?
Well, I always like to go back to my grandmother Rose's family motto, which has been passed down for generations and still seems to be relevant, which is do your best and let them say. I think it's so relevant for us as parents today. We are under so much pressure to be perfect parents in an age of AI and social media and all of the judgment that comes with those tools. But in technology, as in life, there's no perfect version 1.0. You do your best, you iterate, you keep your integrity along the way, and you let the critics and the they out there say what they want. If we can teach our boys and all of our children that same resilience to focus on the quality of their work and their logic rather than the noise of the world, I think they're going to be just fine.
I really, really love that. Thank you. And resilience. Love that word, right? Isn't that what we hope
Yeah,
for all of us?
exactly. We're all still trying to keep that intact and approach it every day.
So, Elizabeth, if anyone wants to reach out to Coco Coders, can you give us the URL or where we can go for more information?
Yep, it's just cococoders.com. Think of it like Coco Chanel, but cococoders.com. And we'd love to have your sons try a free lesson and join one of our courses.
Fabulous. And And we'll include that on the mothersofboys.life website with the show notes of all of this podcast. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Suzy. It's been so fun. It's such a great chat.
If this episode meant something to you, please follow and share the Mothers of Boys Survival Guide podcast on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Sharing helps other moms discover the show. Be kind to yourself, moms.